All right, what is your favorite place on earth? Like your favorite place ever? Now, I have to tell you, one of mine has to be Disney World. I know, I'm not like 10, but that's okay because I love Disney World. And I've only been there once, but the one time I was there, it was the most magical time ever. I went with a friend of mine, her name's Brandy, and it wasn't long ago, and on our second day, we went to Epcot. And while we were in Epcot, we had a fun tour of countries, and we got rained out. Even the Washingtonians said enough to the rain. But it wasn't before I got my Werther's caramel corn from Germany, and I got my Doctor Who water bottle from Great Britain, and we got some nachos from Mexico. Well, turns out Mexico wasn't the best idea, because two magical words laid me out for the next several days. Food poisoning. It was miserable. And on the third day, I was mobile, but I still felt the effects. And we headed to Animal Kingdom for that day. And we were just enjoying ourselves, but very slowly. We had fast passes that day for Mount Everest, which is a roller coaster, and I was so looking forward to it because I love roller coasters. And this one was going to be amazing. I planned on riding it for multiple times. It was going to be the best ever. So we get on the roller coaster, and up we go. Click, 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 click. You know the good sound on the roller coasters when you're going up, and up, and up. And as we passed the trees, up, and I'm like, look over there. I see Magic Kingdom. And look right there, it's Spaceship Earth and Epcot. And look over there, it's the Tower of Terror. Click, 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 click. And then we were plummeting down, and we were screaming our heads off, and we were having a blast until the coaster headed toward daylight, whoosh, slowing to a stop. And I sat there, enjoying the moment to breathe, because I still had a little bit of nausea, and I was looking at the broken tracks in front of us. The broken tracks in front of us. As Brandy leaned over and said, Emily, does this roller coaster go backwards? And I said, no. Yes! As we fell backwards into the darkness, I slammed my eyes shut, I held onto the bars as tight as I could, and I clamped my teeth together as tight as possible because I did not want that day's lunch ending up on the individual in front of me. We made it, barely. I stumbled off the ride, and I headed out to the sunshine, pushing people out of my way, and I collapsed on this big rock outside, breathing the best I could until Brandy came and found me in the sea of people. Change of plans. I'm not riding that thing again today. Change of plans. I want you to know, my dear brothers and sisters, that everything that has happened to me here has helped me to spread the good news. Those are Paul's words in a letter that he wrote to the church in Philippi, which we call the book of Philippians. And today is going to be a glimpse through his letter. I highly recommend reading it in full this week. It is only 4 chapters. In my Bible here, that's 2.5 pages. Easy. And reading the Bible, knowing what it says, are so important. You get to see the story of what God has done over time and is still doing in our lives today. And that's why we have Bibles for free on our concierge cart. That's why we use Bible.com/app to download Bibles on our phone. That's why we have the words on the screen. And to understand Paul's words, we need to understand what he's talking about. Because he says everything that has happened to me. Well, what has happened to him? Paul was born under the name Saul. He was Jewish, highly respected, educated, and as one of the Jewish leaders, he began persecuting Christians. He oversaw their abuse, even their death. In the midst of all of this persecution, he had an encounter with God. Completely changed his life. He began to follow Jesus, and he joined those who he was previously attacking. Change of plans. His life was filled with the adventure of following Jesus, teaching about him, starting new churches, kind of like what we did here. As part of when he first became a believer, he had to go back to Tarsus, his hometown, to grow and learn and allow time for the other believers to actually trust him. And on one of his missionary journeys, he was shipwrecked, he was stranded on an island, he was bit by a snake that should have killed him. He experienced betrayal. He was arrested numerous times. And when he wrote this letter to the Philippian church, he was actually under house arrest, and he was uncertain about what his future held. Freedom, imprisonment, death. And the thing that I love about the Bible is that even though there isn't always an exact answer written out as to what we should do in our situations, the story that God tells envelops all of our lives. The choices and experiences that we encounter are similar whether we live in the year 61 or 2018. Paul's life is like our lives. Things don't always work out the way they should. At least the way that we think they should. For example, I moved to Las Vegas in December of 2013, almost 5 years ago, to help start SOT Church. The first few months were exhilarating. I was in love with this city, with this church, and even before we had launched, God's vision for downtown and the people that he cared about were so tangible. I was hooked, and every single day here was an adventure. But a few months in, a string of bad things started happening. 2 immediate family members had heart attacks. My identity was stolen. I was sick, I was injured, and then my apartment was broken into. Fear entered my life. My tranquility was taken. And I felt unsure of so many things. Then I took a trip back home to Washington. And I was sharing everything that had happened with a friend of mine. And he said, "Do you think that all of these things are a sign that you should move back to Washington?" Side note here. Not that this particular friend thought that, but why do we think that because things are hard, that means that we aren't doing what God wants us to do? Because sometimes hard things are smack dab in the middle of where we're supposed to be. Paul would agree with that because he was arrested multiple times. That wasn't pleasant. It wasn't fluffy clouds and rainbows singing together with harps. It was hard, and it was lonely, and he understood suffering, mostly because he understood that Jesus suffered. And sometimes that suffering and those hard situations that we face are smack dab in the middle of where God wants us to be living. Anyway, my friend asked me, "Do you think that all of these things are a sign that you should move back to Washington?" My answer was vehement. No. No, they're not a sign. It was clear to me, maybe for the very first time, that these situations actually had multiple purposes in my life. First of all, the enemy wanted to distract me from doing what God had wanted to accomplish in my life. But God wanted to use those situations to share his story. His story of hope and perseverance and faithfulness. And that could only be shared if I lived out hope and perseverance and faithfulness. So what's your story? Because that's what we want to look at today. This little bit is only a part of mine. That is just the beginning of what happened and what God has accomplished in this time in the Neon City. And I know some of your stories are of loss and of grief. I mean, we just talked about October 1st. Most places in the country, tomorrow is just the beginning of October. But for us, it's a day of grief. For us, it's a day of tragedy and remembering and pain. Some of your stories are of unexpected miracles. A baby when there wasn't supposed to be another baby. Some of your stories are feeling like you're stuck in the middle of something, but you don't know what that something is yet, and you don't know what your next step is. When you look at Paul's story, and you look at the stories in your own life, we can ask God what purpose he can make of where you are. And now, to clarify, I'm not saying that God causes bad situations, and I'm certainly not saying that everything happens for a reason. But I am saying that God can bring good out of all situations. That God can use each of us and our stories for his purpose. And Paul said, the purpose, to spread the good news. The good news that Jesus Christ, the Son of God, lived, died, and rose from the grave, bringing us into a deep relationship with God. The good news that because of our decision to follow God, we not only have an eternal destination in heaven, we also have hope and love here on earth, and that we have purpose in our lives from him. Paul reminds his friends in the church in Philippi, everything that has happened to me here has helped to spread the good news. God can repurpose anything in our lives. Change of plans. He can use the horrific to lead people to kindness so they can see the kindness of Jesus expressed in tangible ways. He can use financial struggles to reveal his provision and care and deep, deep love. He can use our loneliness to reveal the perfect intimacy that he wants in our lives. So what does that mean for our situations? That means that we get to reframe the unexpected. We get to point to Jesus in all of our situations, good or bad. We get to view our lives from his perspective. And now, caveat, I'm not saying I do this perfectly well. This is a lesson I am continuing to learn. In fact, I have failed miserably at this sometimes. That string of events in 2014 was the start of my opportunities in Las Vegas to reframe the expected. Sometimes I did. Sometimes it was a catastrophic disaster. But here is where I think we are faced with two different opportunities. First, we have the opportunity to reframe events in our lives retrospectively. So maybe you've got something you just came out of. If you haven't heard, I refer to 2017 as the year of poo. So much happened last year that caused pain, both physical and emotional pain, and it is seared into my memory. And I tried to reframe things last year, but honestly, I struggled. But do you know what I can do now? I can look back on that time. I can see where I came from, and I can retrospectively see the work that Jesus did in my life and is still doing as a result of it. As a result of the year of poo, you can ask me any questions about my identity, who I am and who I was created to be, and I will tell you what Jesus has done, who he has made me to be, how he grew me in the last year, and in the thick of the mud that I was in, and since then as well. And I will walk with you through finding your own identity as well. If you are looking back on changes in your life, drastic changes, look to see what God has done and call out those lessons that you've learned. Repeat the story of God's work in your life to those around you. Give them the hope that he has now placed in you. That's the first opportunity we have. The second opportunity, do it now. What are you in the midst of? What is happening in your life right now? What is your change of plans? It has derailed whatever plan you had. Whether it was a crash and burn or an unexpected and wonderful surprise, it still is a change. And you're feeling all of the emotions, trying to get a grasp on what normal looks like now. Now is the time to reframe this. Now is the time to redefine what that change means. And I'm not saying that that's going to go away. It probably won't. Relationships take time to heal. Finances take time to grow. Learning new things requires time. But in the midst of it, in the midst of the change and of the whatever it is that we're going through, what is God doing? How can he use it? How can he grow you? I told you that I feel like I partially failed this last year. So I get it. Sometimes the changes in life can come at you so fast that you feel like you can barely get enough air to survive. But if you can't reframe it in any other way, hold on to Jesus and hold on to Paul's statement that says, I want you to know, my dear brothers and sisters, that everything that has happened to me here has helped to spread the good news. And then you know what Paul instructs us to do? Paul, while he's in house arrest, in this exact same letter to the Philippians, he says, yes, you should rejoice, and I will share your joy. He says, whatever happens, my dear brothers and sisters, rejoice in the Lord. He says, always be full of joy in the Lord. I say it again, rejoice. I've struggled. Guys, I've struggled with joy in my life through the year of poo, since it. And I think that that's why it feels like it's so important for me to emphasize this, because I know that I am not alone. I am not the only person struggling. And when life hits that change of plans, sometimes it is so easy simply to focus on what that change is and on the chaos that surrounds it, and not so much on embracing the joy of following Jesus and allowing him to work. Ultimately, we need to rejoice in change. Rejoice when life doesn't turn out the way you expected. Seek out joy. Seek out hope. Paul tells us his story in chapter 3. He says, I was circumcised when I was 8 days old. I am a pure-blooded citizen of Israel and a member of the tribe of Benjamin, a real Hebrew if there ever was one. I was a member of the Pharisees who demanded the strictest obedience to the Jewish law. I was so jealous that I harshly persecuted the church. And as for righteousness, I obeyed the law without fault. I once thought these things were valuable. Change of plans. But now I consider them worthless because of what Christ has done. Yes, everything is worthless when compared with the infinite value of knowing Jesus Christ, my Lord. And I love the juxtaposition of Paul's life here. I was going this way, but now I've changed my life. I've changed radically the direction that I'm heading, and I'm going in a completely different direction. And there is power in this change. And I think that some of Paul's joy was rooted in the fact that he embraced that change. He saw Jesus at work and wanted to follow him. And that's what I would tell people when they asked me, why did you move from beautiful Washington to the desert? And I said, because God's already at work downtown. God is already doing something. You can see it, and I want to be a part of that. I don't know what embracing change, I don't know what rejoicing in it looks like for each of us. I'm barely starting to figure it out for myself. But look for Jesus working. Find those things that bring you true joy, true peace, and hold on to them. Explore them. Embrace the lessons that God is teaching us through our circumstances. And we also rejoice when we're required to have courage. Whether life is buffeting us and we stay put, or when we're being directed to enact change in our lives. Sometimes simply continuing requires inordinate amounts of courage. Simply holding on and pressing in. Paul held on here. Paul knew that in this situation, God was using his circumstances to change lives, and he held on. Under house arrest, he writes the words. He says, "Everyone here, including the whole palace guard, knows that I am in chains because of Christ. And because of my imprisonment, most of the believers here have gained confidence and boldly speak God's message without fear." Sometimes we hold on, and that's where our courage is. Sometimes our circumstances require that we make a change. And change in itself is neither good nor bad. Change might mean getting a new job. Maybe it means expanding our family or moving, or maybe it's simply adopting a new mindset. Change, though, for most of us, is hard. Change requires courage. What is God asking of you? One of our core values here at Sauk Church is that we jump off cliffs. We make hard choices. And when life gives us opportunities, we jump all in with passion and with fervor. We trust God and we follow him even when we don't know how our choices will turn out. We might end up in house arrest. We might have more people to love. We might end up broke or making $1 million. We might stay in our exact same situation, or maybe we end up moving and leaving those whom we love. So what cliff is right in front of you right now? Paul's journey kept him on his toes, that's for sure. He probably had very hard choices to make. Quite often, he faced death, persecution, arrest, betrayal, uncertainty, lots of uncertainty. And I think Paul would have liked that we talk about jumping off cliffs here. He would have recognized the bravery that it takes in making risky decisions. Decisions filled with faith. Decisions rooted in Jesus' purpose for us. God's desire is to keep us moving and to keep us growing and to keep us stretching in order to share the good news to those in our lives, for our story to accurately reflect God's story. So what is your cliff? If God is calling you to move or stay, take a deep breath and jump. Jump even if you're afraid. Jump even if you're busy. Jump even if you don't know where you're going to land. Jump even if you can't fully plan the next year of your life. If he says to be brave and jump, then do it. And when you jump, rejoice in whatever happens. Rejoice in change. Rejoice in difficulty. Rejoice that we are able to depend on Jesus. And that we can live lives of courage to show his story, to jump off cliffs. When you depend on him, you are sharing the good news because you are showing people in your life that he is dependable. That he is worthy of trusting. And I understand 100% that it is hard. It is hard to see Jesus at work when you're in chains, when the darkness is looming. It's easy to look back on those times in our life and just want to hide them. But where is Jesus? How do we rejoice? How do we face the unknown courageously? We do it through him. As Paul starts concluding his letter, he says, I've learned how to be content with whatever I have. I now know how to live on almost nothing or with everything. I've learned the secret of living in every situation, whether it's with a full stomach or empty, plenty or little. For I can do everything through Christ who gives me strength. Whatever happens, Paul recognizes that he is not self-sufficient. He is God-sufficient. He is fully dependent upon God for every situation. And his contentment doesn't mean that he doesn't jump. His contentment means that he understands that God is in each of these situations, and when he jumps, God will help him to land wherever he needs to be. Paul wants us to follow his example, to be brave. Because when we are brave, the good news is shared. To jump off cliffs. Because when we jump off cliffs, the good news is shared. To rejoice at God's work. Because when we rejoice, the good news is shared.